Now joined via Zoom by political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Good evening, Peter. It's always a pleasure to be on the show and to chat with you, and also to good evening to the viewers.
Well, let's start with those protests. I mean, they were pretty significant in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. I suppose we expected some kind of action. Do you think that it's the size of these protests point to how big the concern was?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Peter, what we have to be careful of is not to trivialize the protest, but at the same time not to overplay it. So I think what we saw around the country, and more importantly in KZN, was the reaction to the arrest and subsequent serving of his time by Mr. Jacob Zuma. And the fact of the matter is that, this was not taken in the way that perhaps people would have been thinking about it in the context of what we saw over the weekend in Kanjla. Whilst I think it's important to recognize that people can protest and they have the right to protest, but I think also what's important is that it has to be done in a manner that doesn't create these kinds of tensions on the ground. And what the images that we saw of how these protests had actually evolved into very, very destructive and sometimes very, very, violent ways, I think is something that's very concerning. Listening to the police minister and what he's talking about and how he has responded to that, to those issues, I think he's also saying that, they're trying to bring calm, they're trying to ensure who's on the ground, how the police are actually managing the situation. And of course, some media reports suggesting that there have been many arrests in this context. But I think the issue at hand here is whether or not these protests are being fueled by the idea that, Mr. Jacob Zuma has been dealt a bad hand. We need to support him. But the support, I think, is very critical. Do you go out and protest because, you think that's the support he needs, and in the process, there's this whole kind of trail of destruction, or do you protest in a manner that's much more peaceful? And I think that's the difference for me in this context. So I don't want to say we shouldn't be worried about it. I think in any protest, particularly in the nature and how it has evolved, I think it does show that we have to have some level of concern, because it's not just about the protest itself. It's about the fact that the protest has implications for stability on the ground, but people that are innocently not involved in the protest become casualties in that protest, or become caught in the crossfire of that protest. And I think that is where we have to be careful in what is the nature of the protest and what is the intention of the protest. And you can protest, but you can do it in a manner that doesn't have to become this kind of level of conflict and instability. And I think that, for me, is much more critical in terms of where we're going, because then it becomes not about, it becomes more confrontational. It's about the instability, it's about the conflict, and it becomes this tension and this incredible hostility in the relationship between the security who are trying to maintain or manage the protest itself, but at the same time, the reaction. So it's not really where we want to be right now. I think where we want to be right now is how do we move forward in terms of what has been a very, very exhausting and a very critical set of issues and events that have come through in the last several days, 10 days, 12 days, with the rulings, etc. And I think the question now is, how do we go forward from here? Where do we go? What is the process going forward? And I think the more we sit in this context of where we are, it's very difficult to see how we're going to move this whole process where we want to go in terms of the democracy and in terms of the rule of law.
There's no question that this is a very politicized matter, and I wonder if it had to have been to be able to mobilize as many people, because at the end of it, actually, it's an individual who was charged by a judicial process about actions that an individual took. However, the way it's playing out, it's almost as if Cyril Ramaphosa is able to pick up the phone to the Constitutional Court and say, I want this guy, etc., etc. And this is how the story is being sold. And this, I suppose, is part of fueling the fire.
Yeah, I think, the rhetoric around it is very important. The messaging that underpins the rhetoric, the intention of what the rhetoric is supposed to achieve. again, comes back to the messaging that you are talking about. And it's very volatile, it's very binary, and it's also very conflictual. And the words that are used to essentially talk about what this is all about, it's the fact of the matter is that there was a whole kind of targeting of former President Zuma. That it was, the fact of the matter is that he didn't do anything wrong, but this was all a kind of conspiracy to get him into jail. Even on social media, when you see the binary arguments that are made, I always wonder whether people are unpacking the layers and layers that are involved in this. Are they, what is the messaging coming out, even from those that were standing at the podium in Kanjla over the weekend, even in the press briefing, even in the interviews that they've been doing? Are they really giving the sense of what the real message is, what the real issues are, or is it all kind of a political play and a theater around which you define your strategy of this political play? And it's very important for people to understand what was the issue at hand. But unfortunately, we live in such polarized society, we lived in such politicized context at the moment, that sometimes trying to get to that kind of understanding of peeling the layers away, you still want to actually say, you know what, it's not about the fact that there was a contempt of court. There was more about the individual. And I think when you have leaders that then exploit that in the way that we have seen it being done and the manipulation around it, it then takes people into the streets. And it's not necessarily exceptional to South Africa. I think we've seen it in other parts of the world where this happens, around personalities, around particular individuals, around the politicization of the issues for a particular of outcome. And I think this is where we have to be careful. Otherwise, it doesn't necessarily mean that what we saw in the prevailing of the rule of law, the whole question of the Constitution, and perhaps even the point you made, the very last point you made about President Ramaphosa, I think the separation of powers, again, is important to understand. But right now, I think people's emotions are very high, and it's very binary in the way it's coming out on the ground.
And I suppose it's further complicated when you have people like the former president's daughter almost encouraging people to go out and protest. Some are even saying that she's inciting violence. She posted a controversial video of someone brandishing a Cyril Ramaphosa poster. She did take that tweet down, but somebody of her position, closeness to the president and visibility, people listen. Sometimes we as individuals, as society, as a collective, we tend to follow more than to stand back and ask ourselves what's going on here. And I think when you have social media, which has become such a ripe platform for these kinds of messaging and these kinds of emotions that run deep, the challenge is how do you manage that space? And I think at the end of the day, the question is really for people who have that kind of social influence, the influencing power on social media and in other spaces, to be able to use that influence in a manner that is not seen to be creating a kind of disaggregated effect, a kind of challenge to the way we see the world and how we want to see the world and what we post. And I think the social influences on social media and in any other platform, again, they have large followers, and of course they know what they're posting and they know why they're posting that. I think, even if you say I posted it but I don't endorse it, the question is people look to your Twitter account. And I think in this context, you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure that you're not reckless, and just to be clear that you are essentially trying to say, this is what's happening. But I think when we get into how do we manage the social media space, how do we manage what people see as fact or fiction on social media, it becomes very difficult, and even in the context of fake news. So I think for me, this whole situation that we see unfolding in South Africa and also around the world, around the question of social influencers and how they play a role on social media, again comes back to the responsibility you have to take
Because at the end of the day, the question is, what was your intention of posting that post?
The other story of the day, of course, embattled, suspended ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule, losing a High Court decision today. What's the significance of that? He seems unfazed a little. He says, yes, I acknowledge that this is what they've decided, but we will take it to a higher court who may be able to go through some of the complexities of the case a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, I think Peter, he seemed to be very confident that they have a solid legal case, a legal argument. I think he feels that the judgment that was made today is one that didn't necessarily deal with those complexities. He feels that one of the case laws that they had cited as part of their argument was not interpreted in the way that he feels there was a wrong interpretation. And so he's arguing very much so that this is something that he feels that can go further because he has a solid team, a solid legal argument. I'm just curious to understand which high court he's going to go to next, or which court he's going to go to next in order to see and to ventilate this issue further in terms of, this court had ruled, they found this judgment, and of course we don't agree with this judgment, so we're going to the next court. And this for me becomes a merry-go-round of litigation, because at the end of the day, you're just basically trying to ventilate this issue as much as you can, hoping that you would get the kind of judgment and outcome that suits you and fits within the context of what you are seeing and what you want to see. And I think, when do we stop this? When do we stop having these kinds of litigation where we keep trying, where leaders like Ace Magashule and others keep trying to use the courts as the default strategy in order to get what they want? Because we have to come to a point where we have to start thinking about what's the way forward. And I think for the party, it is very much part of that discussion, because the constant litigation and the constant challenges and processes of the internal architecture and decisions and resolutions of the party become almost a non-starter. They completely then end up being just there. They don't have any value. And you keep trying to challenge this, and you keep trying to do that. It makes one feel as if, there's no seriousness in this. There's only a specific outcome here, and that is, I want the court to see it my way.
Perhaps I'm over-reading the situation, but listening to the language that he was using, he talked about there is divisions, there are factions, and these are things that they would never have admitted not so long ago. And then he started to say, the ANC has decided, almost as if he's not part of this organization, although he says he is. And I'm just trying to understand that. Have the gloves come off now, and he's saying that there are two ANCs, whatever, and that there's that group in the way that he was talking? Because I found that quite interesting, actually, when he was talking earlier today.
Yeah, I guess what he was, I don't know what he was implying, but I think the language in itself was really about the fact that I don't think the gloves have come off today. The gloves had come off a long time ago. And he, in this context, he's now saying that there is a lot that's happening in the party that perhaps he feels that is not within his ambit of the party. I think for me, the challenge is really it comes down to a very basic thing for me, and that is the question of trying to who controls the party. Because this seems to be the biggest stake in the room, that whoever controls the party controls it going forward. And then, of course, they probably see it as a party that will continuously remain in power, and therefore it has all the other kind of implications for them as they go forward. But I think for Ace Magashule and for others, the challenge is really around, the branding of the party, the value that the party brings to them, not necessarily because they believe in the actual governance structure, but they believe that the party holds very important personal interests and vested interests and material interests. And that's how they see it going forward. And I'm not sure whether that's something that they have thought about in the context of saying, well, this party is something that we need because we want to renew it, we want to rebuild it. I'm not sure if that's the conversation they're having. But the constant threat about there are others that are implicated, there are other names I'm going to bring out, there are other individuals who are basically also caught in these corruption scandals, etc. And then he says something to the effect that in August these things will be revealed, or so to speak. I'm just paraphrasing. It tends to tell me that this is the do or die situation for them. And for the party in itself, because obviously you've got to think about where this rebuild comes from. What's going to be a rebirth of this party? Can there be a rebirth of this party? Where does the party go from here, and how does it salvage itself, given where we are in the last several days and what has emerged and the significant moments and the unprecedented moments we had around the Constitution and so forth, challenging a lot of the legal space and the rule of law and the democratic architecture of the state. And I think for someone like Ace Magashule and for the rest of the team that follows Ace Magashule and the grouping, the question is, what is the salvageable moment for you as well? Because if you're referring to this party as the ANC, I mean, you're still part of it, and you're still very much part of that space. The question is, what part of that identity do you still maintain, and what part of that identity do you actually then refute in terms of the ANC?
All right. I mean, we're going towards local government elections, and it looks as if some players might say, I will say things, I'm going to be forced to say things, whether in court or otherwise, and potentially would be damaging to the party. Do you think that they will cross that line where they say, for my own survival, I might have to damage my party?
Peter, I think they've already done it. The way they've behaved, the way they've acted, the fact that they've taken the party to court, they've challenged the rules, they challenged whether the NEC is the highest decision-making body between conferences. They've already damaged the party. I think it's just a matter of how much more do they want to damage it.
All right. Sanusha, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much indeed. Always appreciate your thoughts and your ideas. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.